Welcome to this lecture on Charles Hubert by William Facey, organised by the International Association for the Study of Arabia, IASA, and the MBI Al Jaber Foundation. I'm Noel Breheny, Chair of IASA. For those that do not know IASA, we are a charitable organisation that exists to advance public knowledge through the promotion of research relating to the cultural and natural heritage of the Arabian Peninsula. We do that by awarding research grants, producing our own publications and supporting those of others, disseminating news of new research and events connected with Arabia, and organising lectures and conferences. Our major event is the annual Seminar for Arabian Studies, which this year runs from 5 to 7 August at the Humboldt University in Berlin. The programme and how to register, it will be available in person and by Zoom are on our website at iasarabia.org. William's lecture will be introduced by Michael MacDonald, a distinguished scholar of Arabia who is known to many of you and who is a trustee of IASA. He collaborated with the author in producing the book. The lecture will be followed by a Q&A. Michael.
Sure. No, that's very kind. Well, William Facey hardly needs an introduction to an audience interested in Arabia. For almost half a century, he's been working on Arabia's past. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he was advising on the regional museums which the government of Saudi Arabia was planning to build, and with great foresight, he photographed the antiquities, which had already piled up, ready to form the collection. Foresight, because many disappeared between the planning and the opening of the museums, and so were saved for science through his photographs. In 2002, he set up Arabian Publishing, which specializes in books on the history and culture of Arabia, both new research and important early works which had fallen into oblivion. One of the hallmarks of Arabian Publishing's books is that they are always beautifully produced and a real pleasure to handle. Will himself usually writes the deeply researched and extremely readable biographies of the authors and/or introductions to their work. Many of you will be familiar with Geraldine Rendell's Across Arabia, 3 weeks in 1937, and The Pilgrimage to Mecca by Lady Evelyn Cobbold, the first British-born Muslim woman to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. Also Eldon Rutter's The Holy Cities of Arabia, and many others. You also published Rob Carter's magnificent Sea of Pearls. Will is an excellent and meticulous scholar, and his history of the old city of Riyadh is another fascinating work. His latest book, which is the subject of this lecture, is on the great but sadly neglected French explorer of Arabia, Charles Hubert, and contains the first ever biography of Hubert by Will, and much, much else. I have greatly enjoyed working with him on the first translation of the German scholar Julius Euting's Travels with Hubert, which we hope will be published shortly, and which led to this wonderful book. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce William Facey, who will speak to us on Charles Hubert, France's greatest Arabian explorer. Thank you. Will.
Charles Hubert, Charles Hubert. Most people who are interested in Arabia have heard of him. He is, after all, one of Arabia's heavyweight explorers, whose reputation puts him on a par with the best known, such as Niebuhr, Burckhardt, Burton, Doughty, and Philby. But the strange fact is that until now, hardly anything has been known about this great French traveller, outside these 2 Arabian journeys. No obituaries seem to have followed his untimely death, nor has there been any published biography, not even in France, where he is chiefly, and I think wrongly, remembered as the discoverer of the Thames Stele. A startling plummet into obscurity, one might think, for a French hero of exploration, and especially undeserved for a man who was, as we shall see, an ardent French patriot. Hubert himself was partly to blame for this. What little he wrote was never worked up for literary consumption. His solitary publication in book form was the Journal d'un voyage en Arabie, issued posthumously in 1891. This concerned his second journey in 1883 to 84. It is a fat volume that looks highly promising until you open it, only to find that it is no more than the faithful reproduction of his notebooks. Meticulous jottings record his daily progress, compass bearings, weather conditions, geological and topographical observations, archaeological finds, inscriptions and graffiti, brief encounters, and so on, which is all jolly useful stuff, but there is no attempt to impose any narrative coherence. And I still remember how disappointed I was when I acquired my copy in the 1970s. But my curiosity about Huber grew when I followed up his first Arabian journey in 1880 to 81, and found that he had written a narrative account of that one, the only one he ever published. It was in the form not of a book, but of 4 articles, which appeared just after his death in the Bulletin de la Société de Géographie of 1884 and 1885. Since then, this highly significant account has never been republished. Until now, that is, in translation, in my new publication, Charles Huber, France's Greatest Arabian Explorer. My attempt to put Huber under the spotlight for the first time and to give him the critical assessment of his life and work that he deserves. In this talk, I'm going to start with Huber's significance as an explorer before giving an account of his early life and character and his first Arabian journey. The focus will then shift to his difficult relationship with the eminent German Semitist, Julius Euting, and then to his second Arabian journey and his death in the Hijaz. To end, we shall take a brief look at the Franco-German imbroglio over the Tema Stele. Turning first to Huber's significance, what emerges most strongly from the report of his first expedition is that he was before his time as a scientific explorer of inland Arabia. His main focus was on geology, topography, and map making. He was championed accordingly by the Geographical Society of Paris and sponsored financially by the Ministry of Education. True to type, he was a relentless collector of data, taking bearings, amassing samples, recording landforms and flora, and compiling word lists wherever he went. As a scientific observer in the region, he was the true heir of Carsten Niebuhr and Jean-Louis Burckhardt, and the true forerunner of Alois Musil and Harry St. John Philby. Like those men too, Huber had a great knack for making friends among the Arabs. He was especially lucky to strike up a warm friendship with the Emir of Hyle, Mohammed al-Rashid, whose political star was just then in the ascendant and whose domain included all of northern Nejd. The Emir's protection would enable Huber to cover some 5,000 kilometers on camelback over 9 months, usually traveling with just a single guide. As a result, a major product of Huber's first journey, and the one over which he took special pains, was the map that accompanied his articles. It is beautifully reproduced in facsimile at almost full size at the back of my book. This map represents a huge leap forward in the European understanding of the Arabian interior. In addition, Huber was an avid seeker out of ancient inscriptions and archaeological remains. Although no Semitist, he was aware of the possible importance of the graffiti he collected. And when he saw the Nabatean inscriptions at Madain Saleh, he resolved to return to make a proper record of them. Huber seems to have prided himself on his sober, down-to-earth approach. He had little taste for colourful traveller's tales and chose to play down his many alarming escapades, often omitting them altogether. Unlike so many British travellers, notably Burton and Palgrave before him, he did not seek success as a best-selling author, nor did he place himself at the centre of his narrative, as, for example, Charles Doughty did, or Wilfred and Lady Anne Blunt. Auguste Hugues Charles Hubert was born in 1847 in Strasbourg, the capital of Alsace. He came from a Catholic home, and a poor one. His mother was a washerwoman, and his father a shoemaker and railwayman. But young Charles was a bright boy with a taste for science, despite his rather erratic attendance at school. He went on to obtain a humdrum job as a clerk and bookkeeper, and used his wages to enroll in courses in physics, chemistry, and anatomy, so acquiring a smattering of medical expertise. He would later develop a keen interest in physical anthropology, as well as in book collecting. He was showing all the symptoms of a classic autodidact. As a personality, he was a loner, but he also possessed a certain charm and persuasiveness. His single-mindedness could occasionally lead him into trouble, notably over women and money. There was a dodgy side to his character, and he could sometimes resort to dishonesty. In 1868, when he was about 20, sorry, I'm just going to try and move on. Should have shown you that map earlier, I'm sorry. This is the great map that is reproduced in facsimile in my book. Anyway, back to the dodgy side of Huber's character. He could sometimes resort to dishonesty. In 1868, when he was about 20, he was convicted of theft, for which he served 6 months in jail. But his Arabian travels would also show him to be a man of enormous courage, energy, and fortitude. His appetite for adventure had its flip side, which was his risk-taking and perhaps even self-destructive streak, which presaged his early demise. He was 22 in 1870 on the outbreak of the brief but brutal Franco-Prussian War. The French had opened hostilities, and their rapid defeat came as an unexpected hammer blow to national pride. Its major results were the newly unified Germany's annexation of Alsace and the destruction and killing wreaked on Strasbourg by indiscriminate bombardment. It is possible that Huber fought as a sniper or franc-tireur deployed in the city's defences, because at some point he suffered a leg wound and walked with a limp from then on. The loss of Alsace was an unspeakable humiliation for France, and especially for French-speaking Strasbourgeois, such as the Huber family. The Hubers refused to renounce their French citizenship, even though the German authorities required them to do so if they wished to stay in Alsace. Huber never relinquished his French nationality, nor did his two brothers, who were imprisoned for doing their national service in France. At some point, he joined Léon Gambetta's Ligue d'Alsace, an anti-German organization urging Alsace-Lorrainers to retain their French citizenship. Prison, invasion, threats to his civic status. During the 1870s, Huber was driven to look elsewhere to find a path in life. Like many young Frenchmen with a sense of adventure, he decided to go to Algeria. Arriving in January 1974, he found employment in the French administration. Here he was exposed for the first time to Arab society and the Arabic language. But once again, he was dogged by scandal. There was perhaps another sexual entanglement, but more serious was, as the French described it, the affair of the Arab skulls that he tried to remove from a cemetery near Algiers and which had to be hushed up. But whatever the shenanigans of his Algerian interlude, it inspired his interest in Arab culture and drew his gaze eastwards. On returning to Strasbourg, he wisely opted to keep a low profile, and he developed into an obsessive bibliophile. But it couldn't last. In 1878, his membership of the Ligue d'Alsace led to his expulsion by the German authorities. He headed for Paris, adopted a false identity, and got a job in a chemical company. Meanwhile, it seems, he was continuing to study Arabic and anthropology and dreaming of Eastern exploits. He was in touch with the Société de Géographie and already in 1878 was devising a plan to go and live in Egypt, to record monuments and inscriptions in the Near East, and to carry out some head measuring in the Hijaz. His plan came to nothing, but he would very soon try again. So now for his first Arabian journey in 1880 to 81. His next plan for an Eastern journey reads like a laughable exercise in trying it on. In 3 short pages, he sketched out a hazily conceived scheme to explore the entire Arabian Peninsula and to go on from there to Iraq, Persia, Afghanistan, and finally Tibet. He planned to take 3 years over this, recording archaeological sites and inscriptions, taking compass bearings and barometric measurements wherever he went. He presented this bizarre proposal to the Ministry of Education, and possibly to his surprise, was awarded the remarkably modest sum he had asked for, 8,000 francs, about £20,000 in today's money. As he set off for Lebanon in May 1879, he was blithely unaware that his past was creeping up behind him. The ministry had just found out about his prison record and was making angry inquiries. Huber, meanwhile, was preparing for his great adventure by improving his Arabic. At the same time, he enlisted the help of the French consul in Damascus to put him in touch with a sheikh of the Rawala tribe that controlled the Syrian desert, so that he could arrange a safe conduct as far as Al Jaber in northern Arabia. It was the obvious and sensible thing to do, but it was to prove far from straightforward. And here we have his first journey. He sets out from Damascus towards Al Jaber, which is where my cursor is. Thwarted by a series of setbacks that might have been lifted from the book of Job, he would need a whole year before being able to get started. Promises of protection from sheikhs prove empty. It was the harshest winter for years, blanketing the routes in snow. His camels fell ill. He fell ill. Finally, having already spent a quarter of his funds, he made it to Bosra in the southern Haran. In May of 1880, bravely deciding to go it alone, he finally threw himself upon fortune, taking on a pair of tribal outcasts as guides, an extremely rash thing to do. But he reached Kaf in safety and then made it down the Wadi al-Sirhan to Al Jaber, where he was able to call upon the protection of Ibn Rashid's governor. In reporting what followed, Huber gives us a glimpse of the kind of writing he was capable of. His observations on the Great Nafud Sand Sea were important and perceptive, debunking Palgrave exaggerations, and his visit to Juba is vividly written. But best of all is his description of his meeting with Muhammad ibn Rashid in all his pomp as a desert chieftain on the southern edge of the Nafud. Huber's ability to win people around came to the fore, and the two men quickly formed the warm, fraternal relationship that would facilitate Huber's Arabian travels. Huber then used Heil as his base for 6 pioneering excursions that would revolutionize Europe's knowledge of northern Nejd. 4 of these trips were relatively local to Heil, enabling him to establish the topography of the great Jabal Aja Massif and other ranges in the vicinity, and to record inscriptions. He was also determined to push south into Al-Qasim and its great towns of Bereda and Aneza. Ibn Rashid was reluctant to let him go because this politically important region lay outside his direct control. However, he did eventually relent, and Huber set off with a single guide. It was a colourful adventure and the risks were real, especially from fanaticism, but he survived to return in one piece. His longest and most dangerous venture then took him westwards along the southern fringe of the Nafud, first of all to Tama, where he reported on the ancient remains. He recorded 3 small pre-Islamic inscriptions there, but most significantly, he does not once mention the Tama stele. He then went on into the northern Hijaz at Madain Saleh and Al-Ula before traversing the tumbled lava flows of the Khaybar Hara through Khaybar itself to Al-Hayat. This was a 9-week trek altogether, again with one guide or at most 2 in places. He was the first to report on the important ancient remains at Al-Hayat, which are now known to date back to the mid-1st millennium BC. Meanwhile, he had written to Paris requesting a further 15,000 francs to enable him to continue his exploration of the whole of Arabia. The reply was chilly. The ministry, peeved at his criminal record and disappointed at the feebleness of an interim report he had sent, was demanding his immediate return to France. Huber was baffled as no explanation was given. But now, deprived of funds, he would have to go home. Unable to make the journey to Jeddah due to tribal unrest, he opted instead to join the returning Persian pilgrim caravan, which was just then, in January 1881, about to leave Ha'il for Iraq. His description of the Hajj caravan is an important document on the pilgrimage and its route along the medieval Darb Zubaydah. Huber spent the rest of 1881 in Iraq, exploring ancient sites in Babylonia, working on a British Museum dig, and reporting on the plague. In December, he decided to return to Damascus along the old direct courier route, straight across the Syrian desert of Darb as-Sa'i. He had traveled at least 5,000 kilometers on camelback. On his return to Strasbourg, he rapidly submitted his report to the ministry in March 1882. He had managed to realize only a fraction of his original crazy scheme to explore the whole of Arabia and go on to Persia and Tibet. But his explorations and the scientific data he had amassed on northern Arabia were recognized immediately by French geographers as a major contribution to knowledge. His most significant discoveries were the pinpointing of the watershed of northern Arabia in the volcanic range of the Harat Khaybar and the mapping of the extent and orientation of Jabal Ajah. He had in effect redeemed himself in the eyes of his patrons, and he had done enough to earn the Society of Geography's gold medal. As his patron, Charles Monnoir, the Société's Secretary General, commented, Huber had shown himself the worthy emulator of Guarmani, Palgrave, Pelly, the Blunts, and Doughty. Turning now to Huber's deniable association with Julius Euting. Back in Strasbourg in early 1882, Huber set himself 2 tasks: to raise funds for a second expedition and to write up his first journey for publication. News of his arrival home was the cue for Julius Euting to enter the stage. Euting, who was 8 years older than Huber, was already achieving eminence as one of the foremost Semitic epigraphists of his generation. A German, born in Stuttgart, he had moved to Strasbourg in 1872 to take up a post at the newly founded Kaiser Wilhelm University, where he was a close colleague of the great Theodor Nöldeke, a man well known for his German nationalist leanings, none of which was likely to endure Euting to a French patriot of Huber's stripe. However, Euting had for long been contemplating an inscription hunting venture into Arabia, and his appetite had been whetted by Doughty's first reports of the Nabatean inscriptions at Madain Saleh. We do not know exactly how and when the two men first met, but Strasbourg was a small city, and the news of Huber's return would certainly have spurred Oyting to seek the Frenchman out. Huber was keen to get out of Strasbourg. He and his family were being harassed by the authorities again, and various allegations of dishonesty were following him around. So he submitted his proposal for a second expedition as soon as he could. This time there was no wild talk of Persia and Tibet, and he was focused solely on Arabia, although he was still planning to explore the whole of the peninsula. He allocated 2 years, and in view of his previous success, was emboldened to request no less than 35,000 francs. The ministry in Paris was warmly supportive, but could not make funds available right away. Huber was kept waiting, and when the award did finally come, not only was he assigned a mere 10,000 francs, but he had to wait for more than a year until August 1883 before getting any of it. By that time, he was in Damascus, having already set out on his second expedition in the company of Oyting. There is no doubt that this is not how Huber had wanted things to turn out. He was by nature a lone operator, and in any case, his first expedition had given him a sense of proprietary entitlement to all the finds in Arabia that he was now going to be showing to Oyting. But Oyting had raised ample funds on his own account from the German authorities, and thus had been able to invite Huber along with him. Added to which, Huber could see that Oyting's expertise as a Semitist would be invaluable in identifying and recording inscriptions. And an additional bonus was Oyting's artistic talent. So it should have been a fruitful partnership, but the two men were destined not to get on. A complicating factor was that each man regarded himself as expedition leader. For Oyting, who had ample German support, Huber had come along as his guest, and he was funding much of the Frenchman's journey out of his own pocket. Oyting had made one formal concession, that all epigraphic finds should go to France, except for a single item, which he would be entitled to choose for himself. He was also happy to let Huber see to the practicalities of organizing the expedition, but other than that, he regarded himself as the senior partner. However averse he might feel to feeling obligated, Huber could not avoid being financially dependent upon Oyting. Despite that, he persisted in regarding the German as a mere fellow traveller, tagging along on an officially French expedition. The two men were also separated by differences in class, personality, religious affiliation, and, worst of all, at a time of Franco-German friction, political allegiance. Oyting came from a prominent Protestant family and was highly educated. A man of diminutive stature, he was physically fit despite an addiction to smoking. Added to which, he was a playful, impish, and sometimes flamboyant character, much given to playing tricks, dressing up, and performing gymnastic stunts. No wonder the earnest Huber couldn't stand him. A further twist was that Huber was having to conceal the fact that he was in the company, of Oyting from his main sponsors in France, the Ministry and the Société de Géographie. The latter in particular had advised Huber strongly against traveling with a German as soon as the suggestion had been first mooted. But as time went by and it became apparent that Oyting had funds while he had none, Huber had decided to press ahead with a joint venture anyway, while anxiously concealing Oyting's participation from the ministry and claiming to have put Oyting off. It was an inconvenient pretense that he had to keep up even when writing to Paris from Central Arabia. Had he lived, he would have had to explain the lie later, but as things turned out, his murder meant that he would never have to. Although the ministry and the Société were kept in the dark about Oyting's presence, others were perfectly aware of it. For example, Huber's other French sponsor, the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres of the Institut de France, was well aware that he was traveling with Oyting. Its famous head, Ernest Renan, was a fan of Oyting's work. He had a great regard for German scholarship and had very probably encouraged the collaboration from the outset. But Renan would later have reason to retract his approval when Oyting won the race to publish the text of the Tamer Stele and also of the Nabatean inscriptions at Medain Saleh. That grievance would stiffen French resolve to recover and hold on to the Stele. In support of the French claim, Renan will later publicize the story that the main reason for Huber's desire to return to Arabia in 1883 had been to obtain the Stele, which, he states unequivocally, Huber had seen in 1880. As Renan and his colleagues wrote in 1891 of Huber's second Arabian journey, thoughts of the Stele had obsessed Huber to the extent of keeping him awake at night and had driven him to return to Tamer. This, as we shall see, and as I believe I have comprehensively demonstrated in my book, was pure invention. Nice picture of Oyting in his Arab gear. Turning now to the second Arabian journey of 1883 to 84. Huber and Oyting had set out together for Lebanon and Syria in April 1883. Huber's second Arabian journey breaks into two parts. The first, in the company of Oyting, ending in March 1884 at Medain Saleh, and the second, when he returned to Hail on his own, and from there travelled to Jeddah and then on to his death at Rabigh on the 29th of July, 1884. For the first part, with Julius Oyting. While still in Syria, the two men contrived to visit many of the great historic sites, such as Palmyra, ostensibly independently of each other, with Huber nervously getting Oyting to play along with the deception that they were not really travelling together. When questions were raised from Paris about Oyting's presence in the region, Huber passed Oyting off as no more than an irritator hanger-on. Oyting showed his good nature and his naivety by colluding with Huber's need to keep their joint venture quiet. By the end of August, the two men were ready to set out for Arabia, and they left Damascus separately to maintain the pretense that they went really together. Huber was still financially dependent on Oyting, and it is clear that from now on that his resentment was growing. As we saw, Huber never published a connected account of his second Arabian journey, and a striking feature of his published notebooks is that he does not once mention the fact that he was traveling with a companion. Oyting has been totally blanked. The route with Oyting covered more or less the same ground. On the map in front of you, Oyting is the orange route and Huber is the green one. So with orange and green is together, you can see where they went in each other's company. The route with Oyting covered more or less the same ground as part of Huber's first journey, across the Nafud from Al Jaber to Hail, and along the southern fringe of the Nafud as far as Tamer and the northern Hijaz. The big difference was that torrential winter rains caused them to be stuck in Hail for 3 whole months, until the end of January 1884. Although they were sharing a house, they seem to have spent little time in each other's company. Huber spent much time hobnobbing in the palace with his friend the Emir and his cronies, while Oyting killed time by going on lone daredevil excursions. He was getting the feeling that Huber wanted to be rid of him, which was actually confirmed to him one day by the Emir himself, who was a fair-minded man. Huber wanted to carry on without Oyting, but was unable to shake him off because Oyting was determined to reach Medain Saleh and record the Nabatean inscriptions. Besides, Huber still needed Oyting's money. Bowing to the inevitable, Huber kept Oyting with him, but later fibbed to Paris that he had made Oyting go off to the west without him. Towards the end of January 1884, the two men were at last able to set off for the Hijaz with their Arab assistant, Mahmoud, and a single guide. Oyting's understanding was that they would return to Hail from Medain Saleh and so they left all their baggage in their house. Along the route to Tamer, and here we can see the only known place where both Huber and Oyting's rock signatures can be found. So it's Jebel Misma on the southern edge of the Nafud. Along the route to Tamer, the two came across several incredibly prolific sites of Islamic graffiti, notably the spectacular Al-Mahajja formation and the huge rock face of Al-Lakat. Very spectacular they are too. This is Al-Mahajja. And you get an idea of the scale. If you look at the little white dot at the base of the hole in the rock, that's a person. It's a sort of cathedral-sized thing. And Huber, another of Huber's signatures, of course. And then the immense rock face at Al-Lakat, which is just west of Al-Mahajja, which is covered with thousands of graffiti all the way along. At Tamer, which they reached on the 15th of February 1884, they scoured the town for more inscriptions. On the 17th, a local man took Oyting to a building where he was shown a stele, lodged upside down in the ground and serving as a door jamb. It didn't take him long to recognize this as an Aramaic inscription of the first importance. When in a state of high excitement, he told Huber about it. The Frenchman bought it, using Oyting's money. He then, according to Oyting, claimed that he had seen it on his 1880 visit, but had failed to recognize its significance. Oyting naively fell for this. What is uncontrovertibly true is that Oyting had never once mentioned the stele to Oyting before, nor had he referred to it in his reports on his 1880 journey, nor had he rushed to find it on arriving at Tamer. True, his expedition notes include a drawing of the inscription, but this was done by Oyting. Huber never once mentions the stele until it is carried to him from the site and he buys it. It's pretty obvious that he had never seen it before and that Oyting, not Huber, was its true discoverer. Not surprisingly, Oyting now decided that the stele should be the single inscription that he was entitled to and staked his claim to it verbally. And here we have the stele. And I don't think this has ever been noticed or published before. I may be wrong, but this is Oyting's drawing in a letter to Noldeke of how he found the stele and how it was situated as part of the door. You can see it upside down with its curved top beneath the ground. And here are both in Oyting's hand. The left hand one is from his notebooks at Tübingen. And the right hand one is the one he did for Huber into Huber's notebook. However, Huber was firmly resolved to keep the stele for France. He wrote as much in a letter to Paris a couple of months later. His determination helps to explain why he remained keener than ever to shake Oyting off. After a short return trip to Tabuk, the two set out from Tamer to Madain Saleh and Al-Ula, leaving their inscriptions at Tamer. At Al-Ula, Huber dropped a bombshell, telling Oyting that he would not be welcome back in Hail, and that he should therefore carry out his inscription copying and head off homewards on his own, either via Jeddah or direct across the Red Sea. Huber himself would go to Jeddah before returning to Hail to collect their belongings. Part of Huber's calculation must surely have been that in this way he would gain sole control of the inscriptions they had so far collected, including the stele waiting for him back in Tamer. It was true that Oiting had made himself unpopular in Heil, but he still reports being shocked by this unexpected news. Despite that, he very soon accepted it, because there was, after all, one enormous advantage for him. He would be able to return to Europe before Huber and publish the Tamer Stele and all his squeezes of the Nabatean inscriptions, before the French could do so. And this is exactly what happened, just as Huber had feared, and to the infinite chagrin of Ernest Renown and his colleagues. Huber and Oiting finally parted company at Medain Saleh on the 27th of March. Oiting finished his squeezes and set off from Al Ola with a couple of guides, making for Al Waj on the Red Sea coast. And on the way, he very nearly came to the same sticky end as would befall Huber 4 months later. Huber from now on was on his own, doubtless much to his relief. Instead of going to Jeddah, as he had told Oiting he would, he returned to Heil, following a route south of Tamer and then along the fringe of the Nafud. The first thing he did back in Heil was to send for the half-dozen inscriptions, including the stele that had been left at Tamer. He wanted to go to Jeddah to pick up his correspondence, send off letters home and his squeezes to Renan, visit the French vice-consul, and collect a consignment of rifles for the Emir of Heil. He planned to return to Heil and collect all his and Oiting's baggage and return to Europe via Baghdad. The journey to Jeddah was fraught with risk as the route ran through the territory of Atayba, at that time a tribe at daggers drawn with Huber's protector, the Emir Mohammed ibn Rashid. Huber was putting himself in grave jeopardy as usual, risking my life 10 times a day, as he put it in a letter. But he succeeded in reaching Jeddah in June, spending 6 weeks there before setting out once more for Heil. He was still toying with the idea of further explorations in Nejd if he could muster the funds, but he had to abandon such plans, both because he had no money and because of the Atayba problem. So he decided instead to go back to Heil by the more northerly route via Medina, taking Mahmoud and 2 guides from the Harab tribe. 2 days into the journey, on the 29th of July, near Rabigh, he met his untimely end at the hands of one or both of his guides, or possibly, as one of them tried to argue later, at the hands of Mahmoud and the other guide. Either way, this was a shameful breach of the tribal code of honor to protect the traveler. Huber was just 36. Was it no more than bad luck? It's hard not to see him as a tragic hero who had paid the price for a flaw in his own character. In his case, his risk-taking streak. He had certainly been lucky to reach Jeddah without being killed. Now his hubris had led him to push his luck for the last time. Huber's tomb in Jeddah. I would like somebody to tell me, please, if this monument still exists. I've been unable to establish whether or not it does. His untimely demise robbed 19th century Europe of a major source of information about Northern Arabia. Huber himself tells us in his report on his first journey that he was saving all his notes on the history, politics, and social conditions in Nejd for a separate work at a later date. This, of course, would have been fascinating and of the utmost importance, but it was not to be. And the world would have to wait for a later generation of scholar travelers, notably Alois Musil, Gertrude Bell, and Harry St. John Philby, to continue Huber's project. These three, in their dogged and systematic pursuit of data, were Huber's true heirs. He had fallen in love with Arabia and was determined to return. If I were rich, he wrote of his resolve to return to Tamer, so deep is my love for Arabia and science that I would undertake these excavations at my own expense. Had he lived, he would undoubtedly have returned many times and earned the epitaph that Philby would later claim for himself as Arabia's greatest explorer. Instead, his 1884 journey marked the end of a short, albeit intensive period of European exploration in northern Arabia. Now for something short and snappy on the Tamer Steely imbroglio. Huber's death marooned the Steely in Heil, sparking the imbroglio that added an archaeological dimension to the tension between France and Germany. Diplomatic ructions eventually led to Oyting's friend, the Dutch scholar Christiaan Snoek Hugronje, being expelled from the Hijaz by the Ottoman authorities, urged on by the French vice-consul in Jeddah, Félix de Lostelot. Snoek had arrived in the Hijaz shortly after Huber's murder in order to carry out his famous study of the Muslim pilgrimage. And just as the French vice-consul was gearing up to recover Huber's body from Rabe and his possessions from Heil. As a friend of Oyting, Snoek had first supported the Germans' claim to the Steely, but backed off once it became clear that the French regarded him as a threat and had the power to undermine his project in Mecca. Though largely innocent of meddling, as far as I can judge, the damage had been done by his initial support for Oyting, and he was eventually forced out of Mecca just before the actual pilgrimage of 1885. Whose claim to the Tamer Steely was valid? In my book, I present a forensic examination of the evidence for who first found it and for which country, France or Germany, was entitled to its possession. There's no time to go through these arguments in detail here, but one has to start by treating these as two quite separate issues. In brief, there can be little doubt that Huber did not see the Steely on his first journey in 1880, as Renown would later claim. For the reasons given above, it is obvious to me that Oyting was its true discoverer, but I would happily be proved wrong by somebody in the light of further evidence. As for who was entitled to it at the time, my opinion is that France's claim was the stronger. Even though the Steely had been discovered by Oyting and paid for with his money, it was the French vice-consul de Lostelot and his Arab agent, C. Aziz, who went to the trouble and expense of fetching it from Heil and bringing it to Paris, enduring many indignities in the process. And here is the redoubtable C. Aziz. For the French, the prize was worth the trouble. One only has to look at the brouhaha surrounding the discovery of the Moabite stone in 1868, or the fraudulent Shapira scroll in 1883-84, to appreciate the massive public interest aroused by the recovery of ancient inscription from the lands of the Bible, and the enormous prestige conferred by their acquisition. The Tamer Steely took its place as one of the prized possessions of the Louvre, and I think rightly so at the time. As for who's entitled to it now, that is another question again. When it comes to the continued retention by collections in the West of the heritage of other countries and cultures, attitudes are shifting, and it will be interesting to see whether there is ever a move to return the Tamer Steely to its country of origin. I'd like to end with some deeply felt thanks. First of all, I've been incredibly lucky to benefit from Michael MacDonald's collaboration in my work on Huber. As just like his collaboration on our forthcoming edition of Julius Oyting's Tag Book. Everybody knows what a great scholar he is, and I thank him warmly for agreeing to be involved and for all his sage advice and contributions. Equal gratitude must go to Professors Christian Robin and Maria Goria of the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres of the Institut de France. for their very generous support with my research. Maria, in particular, went way beyond anything I could have expected in digging out archives relating to Huber in Paris. And Christian has generously contributed the foreword to the book.
First series they've played under their new one-day coach.
Many other people have helped me during this 2 years of writing the book, but I'm too many, unfortunately, to mention here. But lastly, my thanks go to IASA for inviting me to give this lecture, and to you all for tuning in, especially as it's such a beautiful evening out there. Quickly, before I sign off, a puff for the book. Arabian Publishing is offering a generous discount until the 22nd of July of 20% off the list price. Well, I think £30 is already a snip, and I think £24 is even more of a bargain, so hurry, hurry, hurry. Okay, and thank you very much to you all for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Will. That was fascinating. Even for somebody who actually has been working on it with you and has been tracing your discoveries as they go along. So that was really, really fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you for the kind things you said about me, which now, do we have any questions in the if not, then I will take the opportunity to ask you one myself, which I don't know why I never asked it before. And that is, was all the information in on the second journey, published in 1890, whatever for, used to improve maps of Arabia? By the Société de Géographie or somebody else?
Yes, that's worth exploring, and I haven't explored that with the Société in Paris. Somebody definitely should. What I did discover, because I spent an awful lot of time in the Royal Geographical Society in London, was that an attempt was made to make a very large-scale hand-drawn maps of all the journeys up to 1914 through Northern Arabia. And we're including Gertrude Bell, Douglas Carruthers, Huber and Euting, Palgrave, and all the rest of them. The reason I know this is that one sheet survives, which is a sheet along the southern edge of the Nafud, jolly useful, and one day I'll be going back to it. But the tantalizing and incredibly frustrating thing is that they can't find the other 3 sheets. So frustrating.
Yes. I hope they do soon.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to go back and try and urge them on.
Yes. Now, Noel, do you see any more?
There are 2 questions in the chat so far. If anybody else wants to ask a question, you have to put it in the chat or raise your hand so that on the reactions button, and I'll call you. But there is a question from Harold Walker. It's known that Huber initially learnt his Arabic, books and/or personal instruction. How he improved it? How good was it? How good was his Arabic?
I think his Arabic was excellent. It's the colloquial Arabic of Northern Najd, I think, was, very impressive. When he was in Lebanon at the beginning of his first journey, he spent a couple of months in a monastery there, specifically improving his Arabic and learning it. And I think that was his springboard for acquiring the language as he went on through his journey. But there's no doubt that he made terrifically good relationships with all his Arab colleagues in the region. And I think I'm sure he just conversed with them as one of them in the end. Now, his classical Arabic's another matter. I mean, no doubt he learned classical in the monastery, but I think his real skill was in the colloquial Arabic of Northern Najd.
Thank you. There's another question here. You've had many thanks for your interesting lecture from a lot of people. But the strict question is, I'd like to know if there are any reports regarding Huber's journey along the Dar Zubaydah, 1880 to 1881.
Yes, in his third article of 1885. In the Bulletin de la Société de Géographie, there's a detailed description naming the places that he stopped. And in my book, I go to a lot of trouble to analyze this and to compare it with all the sites visited in the 1970s by Dr. Saad Rashid, who is, of course, the great expert on the Saudi part of the Saudi part of the Dar Zubaydah. So yes, please buy my book and see it analysed in probably tiresome detail.
Not at all.
Are there any more questions? If anyone would like to ask questions, use the reaction button and put the hand up like this, then I'll be able to see it. Or put it in the chat, please.
While we're waiting for other people, can I ask another question? And it seems extraordinary that Renown, who knew about Euting's presence with Hubert, didn't mention it to one of his learned colleagues like Monnoir. But do you think it's that it's from that he did mention it, and that's how they discovered in the Société, or the Ministry of Education, that he actually was traveling with Euting?
No, it's not. I think that the AIBL, Renown's organization, and the Société didn't communicate.
Oh, really?
And the ministry found out from reports from the consuls writing letters from Damascus and Cairo that Euting was in the area. And that's why they wanted Huber to explain what Euting was doing there when they thought that Euting had been given the cold shoulder.
Ah, right. Oh, thank you.
And Huber said, oh, he's not really here. He's just an irritating hanger-on.
Yes.
I see Derek Kennett's hands up, but there was another question in the chat which I'll put first. You mentioned that he was killed by his guides, but is there any detail of why? What was the motive? What was their motive for killing him?
Yeah, one of them was interviewed later. He'd been actually ostracized by his own fellow tribespeople and was living somewhere near Medina. And he said it was because Huber was a Christian dog and he shouldn't have been there. So it's fanaticism.
Derek, would you like to put your
Thank you, Noel. Yes, thanks very much, Will, for as usual, a very interesting lecture, very engaging lecture. And it's a pretty obvious question, I guess, but I'm just wondering, what do you think was the driving energy behind this? I mean, you mentioned that he was from a fairly lowly family. Is it some element of social advancement, or is it just that? Is it just that sense of adventure and that sense to get out there in the world that was driving him, that gave him this energy? What's your analysis based on the knowledge that you've gained of this guy?
Well, one of his friends did right, actually. Yeah, he was very keen on advancing himself socially. He wanted to get out of his background. He wanted to be a somebody. So, and he wanted to be a great explorer. You know, he was full of explorer's ambition.
Do you think that was it then?
Yeah. I mean, he had all Philby's ambition.
Yeah.
Without any of Philby's rather kind of, upper class background.
Yeah. So it was at that time, really, this was a way of being at the cutting edge and social advancement and being an interesting person to have at a dinner party and that sort of thing. Do you think is that sort of fascinating? Thank you very much, Will.
Okay, pleasure.
Well, there is another related question in the chat. With the excellent and extensive survey and archaeological work in the area of Al-Ula by the Royal Commission for Al-Ula, is there any indication of any official moves for the return of the Timer stele?
Well, yes. Thank you for raising that one. Not that I'm aware of. Perhaps this will spark such a process. Perhaps this has lit the blue touch paper. I don't know. Maybe.
Yes. Are there any more questions?
Could I just butt in again? I'm sorry. But one of the curious things is that although Euting explained that the language and script of the Tamer stele were Aramaic to Hubert, Hubert consistently calls it Phoenician.
Yes.
And have you any ideas why?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, Euting himself, when he first saw it, in the moment, thought it was Phoenician.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as he had a chance to look at it properly, then, dawn the next morning, he realized that it was Aramaic. Mm-hmm. But he probably, when he first told Huber about it, he probably said, "Oh, I found this marvelous Phoenician inscription." Mm-hmm. And Huber liked that idea. In 19th, early 20th century, people like to speculate that the Phoenicians had been all over Arabia and Bahrain and all that, and were looking for evidence to support this theory, which now seems, which obviously now is completely without foundation. But in those days, it seemed like a plausible thing, didn't it? Mm-hmm. So I think that's what Huber probably thought this was, much more sensational than a boring Aramaic inscription, I guess.
Yeah, there's another, I think it's a question or comment. More elaboration is needed regarding Huber's ties, in inverted commas, with the Dutch Orientalist, Christiaan Snoek Runge, who was in Mecca at the time, then, as you mentioned.
More
elaboration about his ties. What were the ties between Huber and Snoek?
Huber didn't really have any ties with Snoek.
Oh, no.
Snoek's ties were with Euting.
Euting, yeah.
Yeah, and that is really, I mean, the whole thing of Snoek and his Hijazi episode is really fantastically interesting. And may I refer the questioner to the works of Professor Jan Just Witkam, which are just being published now by Brill, on Snoek Gronin's writings on his jazz experiences. Very important stuff.
And there's another question. What does the Tamer stele say? The Tamer stele say?
Okay, can I refer the question to Michael?
I thought you might do that. Okay, so it's a record of in a temple that was the temple of one of the manifestations of the chief god in Tamer, who was called Saun. And this was he was Saun of Hagam. Yes, Saun of Hagam. So it's a bit like Our Lady of Lourdes or Our Lady of Walsingham. You have statues which represent the deity in a particular place, and so they're known as Our Lady of such and such, or in this case, Saun of such and such a place, Hagam. So, and rather curiously, he is sharing this temple with two other deities, one called Shingala, who isn't known anywhere else, and one called Ashima, and they are allowing another manifestation of Saun to come into the temple with his priest. So how you manage to have two manifestations of the same deity in one temple, don't ask me. Anyway, this stele allows for the maintenance of the priest of this new deity. And it says he can have the product of 18 date palms from the land of the king, and 6 date palms from the land of the temple, and that will, you know, support him and his offspring for forever and ever. So that's more or less what he did. So it's actually a very sort of everyday sort of inscription. It's not the content is not fantastically important, but it is the only one we have of this sort of explaining this sort of thing, and one of the longest inscriptions we have from Tema. So I hope that explains a bit. Sorry.
Thank you. I can't say. Oh, there is a more question. Dr. Mohammed, could you unmute and put your question?
Please, yes. Hello, everybody. Actually, I didn't know about the sound.
So,
Is the sound all right?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yes.
All right. I'm just wondering about the stele when Charles Jaber, I believe, he reached Jeddah. Stele was handed by him to the French consul. Then he came back heading towards Hail, where he was killed by his guide. And the assassination or the killing, I think, was initiated by, because Jaber had a piece of weapon, and the guide want, I think, to take it. That's what I think documented.
I would love to know what your source is for this information.
Okay, I'm just wondering, Mr. Facey, about there are some documents and letters belonging to outings in Germany.
Yes.
Because it happens that I read some a certain dissertation written by Helen Person,
Yes.
about the relationship between Jaber and outings. I'm just actually mentioning these documents because they have many information. I mean, shedding some light in the relationship between them, letters and some diaries.
Yes. Thank you.
About the last comment about the death of Jaber, was it some, I read a certain article, I can't remember it. They say, I think Ibn Rashid was behind it. I didn't know whether it's true or not.
I have read this in the introduction to the Arabic translation of Huber's first journal.
Thank you.
But I have no idea where this information comes from, and I think it is false. Do you hear me?
Yes.
No basis for it that I can see.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've just run out of time, so that's thank you very much for all the questions, and thank you, William, for
Pleasure.
a wonderful lecture. I was an extraordinary man, most unlikely traveller, but one who clearly has made his contribution. Thank you, Michael, too, for helping guide us through this. And I hope that you all enjoyed this lecture. We're hoping to arrange our next lecture during the seminar, which will be in Berlin in between 5th and 7th of August. It'll be available by Zoom. And if we can fix that, we'll let you know. And if you'd like to support IASA's work, please do so by joining us or by donating to our research funds grants, which are used to support new research in the Arabian Peninsula. You can find full details on our website, www.iasaarabia.org, or you can contact us by, or contact me by writing to contact@theiasa.com. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope you all enjoyed the evening as much as I did. Thank you.